To become a mere Molinist, all one has to do is affirm two propositions. Number one, God possesses middle knowledge, and number two, humans possess libertarian freedom. These are the two pillars of mere Molinism. And after surveying the scriptural support, perfect being theology, and philosophical arguments, many Christ followers seem to think that these two key ingredients are non-controversial and easy affirmations, unless one is previously committed to either exhaustive divine determinism, what I call ED, or open theism. With these two propositions in mind, I'm often asked what I would do if I were eventually convinced that Molinism is false, and I had to choose between either Calvinism or open theism. This is a tough question for me to answer because it seems to me that both of these competing systems affirm what A.W. Tozer described as a low view of God. Now, since I'm committed to the highest view of God possible, I suppose I would have to give the nod to open theism over Calvinism. This is because it seems to me that while both views degrade God's maximal greatness, the open theist typically has a low view of God's knowledge, while the Calvinist affirms a low view of God's character. To the open theist's credit, it seems that they hold the view that God does not know the future or possible futures, as Dr. Strange does, in an attempt to save God's character and omnibenevolence, which Calvinists often reject. The open theist, however, seems to throw the baby out with the bathwater and goes too far in their attempt to defend God and affirm his omnibenevolence by denying his omniscience, as traditionally understood. To make a case for this low view of God's knowledge, the open theist typically offers the philosophical argument known as the grounding objection and cites a handful of vague Bible verses in the Old Testament. Jacobus Erasmus and I have previously argued that the grounding objection is unconvincing in chapter 15 of Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. So the rest of this video will be spent surveying the 5 Bible verses from the Old Testament that seem to serve as the biblical foundation for many open theists. These 5 verses focus on the word perhaps in an attempt to argue that the future is unknown to God and unsettled and thus open. If God does not know the future with certainty, he obviously cannot know possible futures either, and thus the open theist opposes middle knowledge and Molinism. My friend, who is an advocate of open theism, respectfully challenged me with the question, why would God say perhaps if he wasn't confirming possibilities do exist and was denying that all is predestined? To be clear, I've argued that if Molinism is true, then all is predestined, but not causally determined, and that there are still real possibilities available to libertarian free creatures. Be that as it may, my open theist friend then shared the following definition of the word perhaps, used to express uncertainty or possibility. He then provided the following biblical data from the New King James Version. Let's start with Numbers 22, verse 33. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If, perhaps, she had not turned aside from me, surely because I would also have killed you by now and let her live. Okay. Then he offered Jeremiah 26, verse 3. Perhaps everyone will listen and turn from his evil way, that I may relent concerning the calamity which I purpose to bring on them because of the evil of their doings. Jeremiah 36, 3. It may be, perhaps, that the house of Judah will hear all the adversities which I purpose to bring upon them, that everyone may turn from his evil way, that I may forgive their iniquity and their sin. Ezekiel 12, verse 3. Therefore, son of man, prepare your belongings for captivity, and go into captivity by day in their sight. You shall go from your place into captivity to another place in their sight. It may be, perhaps, that they will consider, though they are a rebellious house. Hosea 8:7. They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no bud. It shall never produce meal. If, perhaps, it should produce, aliens would swallow it up. He followed this biblical data with the question and implied objection and said, if I told you I might go to church this Sunday while knowing and believing I will not go to church this Sunday, did I mislead you? Why or why not? If so, why not apply the same standard to God and His Word? That's a good question, but it should be noted that this going to church on Sunday example is unlike the biblical data offered. God never says, perhaps I will do X or not X. Rather, God speaks of the alternative possibilities that free creatures have at their disposal. Moreover, if God doesn't want to reveal the entire truth for morally sufficient reasons, perhaps to strengthen the reader's faith, then using perhaps language seems just fine. Be that as it may, it seems that far too much theological freight is being loaded on top of these 5 vague verses, all while ignoring the rest of Scripture and other arguments. After all, suppose that I've already planned a surprise birthday party for my colleague. His friends and family are already invited, presents have been purchased, and the cake has already been baked. Then I call my friend and say, you should come over to my place on your birthday. Perhaps you'll be surprised with a party, and if you're lucky, I may or may not have bought you a present. Would anyone condemn me as being misleading since the party is already settled and I've already purchased his present? Perhaps. Only the open theist. Now, what if I invited my colleague to meet me at the coffee shop to discuss theology and said, come meet me at the coffee shop this afternoon to discuss why Molinism makes the most sense of Scripture? I might even buy you your favorite drink. Now, even if it was settled in my mind that I will buy my colleague a cup of coffee, there's nothing deceptive about using this manner of speaking, as the French say, a façon de parler. If I was trying to influence and coax my colleague to meet me at the coffee shop without twisting his arm too much, then it would be entirely acceptable for me to speak in perhaps language, even though I'd already settled the fact that I will buy him a cup of coffee. To keep this odd hermeneutical interpretation, the open theist would have to make a strong argument that Hebrew writers thousands of years ago would never use such façon de parler regarding the word perhaps. Given the vast amount of figurative language used in the Old Testament, as well as anthropomorphisms about God and his relationship to humanity, I see no need to interpret these 5 verses in such a wooden and literal manner as Ken Ham might interpret Genesis. Now, what really ought to get one's attention is the fact that Scripture is clear that God does possess definite and certain knowledge of possible futures that never come to pass. One of the most popular cited biblical passages is found in 1 Samuel 23, 6 through 14. Here, God lets David know a truth to a counterfactual proposition, namely that if he were to stay at Keilah, then Saul would pursue him, and that if Saul were to pursue him, then the men of Keilah would give him over to Saul. Jeremiah 38, 17 and 18 also provides support for God's counterfactual knowledge. This passage makes it clear that God knows what would happen no matter what course of action Zedekiah chose to take. Additionally, consider that the test of a true prophet is the fulfillment of his predictions, according to Deuteronomy 18:22. Some predictions given by biblical prophets, however, are never fulfilled because the people who these prophecies were delivered to responded by changing their lives. We see this in Isaiah 38, 1 through 5, Amos 7, 1 through 6, and Jonah 3, 1 through 10. Thus, the people who chose to change their lives avoided the consequences of what would have happened if they had not changed direction. Isaiah provides the test of the true God versus the trial of the false gods. The primary test Scripture provides for humanity to recognize the difference between the one true God and false gods is that a maximally great being has certain knowledge of the future, including the future choices of humanity. The Old Testament is rife with examples of what an omniscient God knows. But God knows not just what will happen in the future. He also knows what would have happened in other possible futures or possible worlds that he had the power to actualize or not. The Open Theist asserts that God does not know the future or possible futures with certainty. With that in mind, Jesus stands in opposition to Open Theism. Consider the knowledge possessed by the second person of the Trinity. In the 13th chapter of John, Jesus provides certain knowledge of Judas's betrayal. Jesus did not say, "One of you is probably going to betray me." No, he provided knowledge of what will definitely occur, not to mention the specific knowledge of Peter's 3 denials of Christ before the rooster crowed. The divine determinist, typically the Calvinist, says that Jesus knows the future sin of Judas because God had already settled the fact that he would causally determine Judas to sin. Thankfully, the Open Theist, along with the Molinist, sees the absurdity of such a claim. The maximally great and perfectly loving God revealed to us in Scripture is not the author of evil or a deity of deception. To the Open Theist's credit, they typically affirm that humans possess libertarian freedom and that when we sin, we did not have to sin, as Paul makes clear in 1 Corinthians 10:13. Here's the conundrum for the Open Theist. If God does not causally determine the sins of humanity, then how did Jesus know the future free sins of Judas with certainty? A sin that would certainly lead to the atoning death and resurrection of Christ. A maximally great God with middle knowledge would be in a position to know how Judas would and will freely choose in a libertarian sense with certainty. After contemplating Open Theism's attempts at justifying their low view of God with biblical data, Kirk McGregor noted the following in his biography of Luis de Molina, quote, "In short, the Molinist can consistently affirm the full scope of the biblical data, while the Open Theist can only consistently affirm a subset of that data and is forced to explain away or ignore the sizable remainder." End quote. Calvinists have the same problem. The best view is one that can account for all the biblical data and not just a subset of it. I invite you to join the Mere Molinism Facebook group to continue discussing human freedom and divine middle knowledge. Perhaps I will share more arguments for Molinism. See what I did there? Stay reasonable.